I want to start out by thanking our panelists here for making the trip here. They've all been very active to help promote and highlight the life of Ulysses S. Grant in different ways. We certainly appreciate their enthusiasm and the expertise that they're going to share with us all today. So without further ado, I will introduce each of our panelists. We'll start with Dr. George Al Goethals. He is an author, a social psychologist, and professor of leadership studies at the University of Richmond, with areas of expertise including presidential and Civil War leadership. His recent works include Presidential Leadership in African Americans, which explores how 8 U.S. presidents, including Grant, have dealt with issues of race. Another work is Realignment, Region, and Race, which deals with how the Democratic and Republican parties have changed their positions on racial issues since the time of Lincoln. Al has been a great friend and supporter of our organization for many years. In the middle, we have Frank Scutaro, who is a lawyer, a historian, public advocate, and politician who authored President Grant Reconsidered. He led the efforts in the 1990s to restore Grant's tomb and is president of the Grant Monument Association. Frank is currently working as an attorney for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and continues advocacy for preservation efforts at the tomb. We're also pleased to have with us Dr. Fleche. He's a professor of history at Castleton College and author of the award-winning book, The Revolution of 1861, The American Civil War and the Age of Nationalist Conflict. Andre has made multiple presentations for the Friends and has shared his expertise in Civil War history. My name is Ben Kemp, if you don't already know me. I'm the Friends of Grant Cottage Operations Manager, and I will serve as the moderator of today's discussion. Compared to these gentlemen, I have no credentials. The only thing all four of us share, besides an interest in Grant, is we've all been on C-SPAN at one time or another. So I would like to start out by giving our panelists an opportunity to give a brief opening statement to let them tell us a little bit about what inspires them in their research about Grant. So why don't we start with Al?
Yeah, is this working? Yeah, but Ben asked us to talk a little bit about how we got interested in Grant and maybe a comment on today's topic. I got interested in Grant actually 40 years ago. I had a sabbatical at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And little did I know that the Civil War was not really over. And that everything was about Grant and, not Grant, Jefferson and Robert E. Lee. And I got interested in the Civil War, visited Appomattox. And really I was looking at it from Lee's point of view, and Grant kind of faded into the background as he often does. And then I think the next year I started reading Shelby Foote's 3-volume Civil War narrative. And if you've ever read that, or if you haven't, let me suggest that you start with the opening pages of volume 3, which has a wonderful description of Grant coming to Washington, D.C., checking in at the Willard Hotel in March of 1864, looking kind of run down and beat up, and perhaps like he'd drunk too much and people were ignoring who he was until he signed the register, U.S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois. It stops too and looks at him in a totally different light. I must say that William McFeely's 1981 biography almost killed my interest in Grant. But I maintain enough of an interest to actually be here on July 23rd, 1985, which is the 100th anniversary of Grant's death. Apparently there was some kind of observance in the morning. I came in the afternoon, and Tony Gambino, who had been a long time caretaker along with his wife, was here. And since then my interest in Grant and the Cottage have grown together. And I've got to say, I think the relationship between Grant and the Cottage is wonderfully captured in the prologue to H.W. Brand's book, The Man Who Saved the Union, Ulysses Grant in War and Peace. Just a couple of sentences. In a chair on the porch of a cottage in the mountains, an old man sits. The summer sun warms the air, the trees, the cottage, the porch. But the old man wears a wool cap and wraps himself in a blanket and still feels cold. Yet he pushes aside his discomfort, even as he ignores the sharp pain in his throat, to focus on his work. Paper and pencil are his instrument. A laptop desk, his workspace. The task transports him beyond his chill, beyond his pain, across the years. He recounts his life for a public that he cannot see, but that is watching him, and has been watching him for the 2 decades since he became a nation's hero. And then it ends. The remaining challenge is to finish his tale. I must try to get some soft pencils, he writes, as the light fades and his scratchings grow harder to read. I could then write plainer and more rapidly. His son is helping. Buck has brought up the last of the first volume in print. In 2 weeks, if they work hard, they can have the second volume copied, ready to go to the printer. If he can hold out that long, he will be able to rest. I will then feel that my work is done. And let me just say very briefly on the topic, which I think is mythical hero or mere mortal, it could just as well be mythical villain and extraordinary hero. There's some wonderful psychological studies of Grant compared to other presidents that was published in 1986. The research was done probably 100 years after he died, almost exactly, which portrays him to be A, unlike any other president, and B, kind of an incompetent slob. Lowest of all the presidents on achievement drive, intellectual brilliance, charisma, and highest on neurotic. And one thing we'll get into, and Frank's work has touched on this, is how Grant's reputation sank like a stone for 100 years and then has been enjoying quite a rebirth in the last 34 years or so.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Frank.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the Friends of Grant Cottage for hosting and for doing such a wonderful job preserving this national treasure. To start with a little bit of background on how I got interested in Grant, it really all started when my parents bought an encyclopedia set when I was 7 years old. I went through it from A to Z and got caught on not the Grant article, but the article on presidents. But that was my entry to a lifelong passion for U.S. history. And presidents and presidential administrations are a wonderful way to explore and understand our history. When I got to Grant, it started focusing more on the presidents in depth. At some point between the ages of 12 and 13, I was also looking a bit more at Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt. The more that I read about Grant's presidential reputation, which was rock bottom, as Al mentioned, the less I could understand or seem to justify it by the facts. And that began an analysis that eventually led to the short book that I wrote, Reassessing Grant's Presidency, and to a broader interest in all aspects of his life and public career. But to address today's topic, let me start with an episode from Grant's post-presidential trip around the world. When he was in Hamburg, he was toasted by the American consul as the man who had saved the country. Grant's response to this toast first thanked the consul for the generosity of his remarks, but he said, "I must dissent from one remark of our consul, to the effect that I saved the country during the recent war. If our country could be saved or ruined by the efforts of any one man, we should not have a country, and we should not now be celebrating our 4th of July. There are many men who would have done far better than I did under the circumstances in which I found myself during the war. If I had never held command, if I had fallen, if all our generals had fallen, there were 10,000 behind us who would have done our work just as well, who would have followed the contest to the end and never surrendered the Union." Grant downplayed the notion of prominent figures being superheroes. He even began his memoir as "Man proposes and God disposes." I suppose everyone here would agree not only in Grant's case, but in others, that we are dealing with mortals. Yet there is something in human psychology that causes people to elevate mortals to heroes when they serve as leaders. When thousands of men risk their lives in battle, there is an emotional component that attaches to the commanding generals that they follow. The same is true of presidents. Power has that effect on people. But the fact that we're dealing with human beings doesn't mean we should make the mistake of debunking the very notion of the heroism of leaders, just as we should not debunk the brave soldiers and sailors who risk their lives for a larger cause. Now, public reputations are often distorted, and when they are distorted downward, as Grant's was for much of the 20th century, the denigration is almost always rationalized with some loss of perspective. Now, I could write a novel about a pro-baseball pitcher who pitches a perfect game in every outing. And that pitcher would make the great pitchers in real life, you take your picks, Cy Young, Walter Johnson, Roger Clemens, Clayton Kershaw, would make those real life pitchers look terrible by comparison. But that, of course, would be fiction, and not a very good fiction, because that fictitious picture would bear no resemblance to the human beings who actually pitch. Of course, we shouldn't judge people except with perspective as to other similarly situated people. The denigration of Grant, while surely fueled by political and cultural agendas, was enabled by a loss of that perspective. This is evident in the loss but overwhelming, overarching reality of Grant's victory. After 6 commanders in the East failed to secure a decisive victory for the Union, it was that 7th commander, Grant, who came in and finally secured victory. After he came east as Supreme Commander of the Union armies, Grant, in fact, was the only one who developed a continental strategy. He conquered territory on a scale to merit comparison with the great captains of world history. And unlike Napoleon, he never had a Waterloo. Now, the presidency, too, was an area where he towered above both predecessors and successors with rich achievements in both domestic and foreign policy. His administration marked nothing less than the culmination of America's second founding, which Reconstruction truly was, along with the Civil War that immediately preceded it. Grant's public career, if you take it through his presidency from the Civil War, promoted and witnessed a more sweeping transition in the status of black Americans from slaves to full equals under the law than that of any of his peers in American history. His Reconstruction policy, of course, would be repudiated and with tragic effects, but the constitutional and statutory architecture that he helped put in place formed the basis for the government's return to civil rights during the 20th century. Now, only recently are historians really recognizing this. Yeah, when you look at Grant's early life, people who saw him never predicted he would achieve the heights that he achieved, and you can see so many points of evidence of frailty, of vulnerability, or things that don't seem to smack of greatness, or not at least mythical heroism. You can start with his class standing at West Point, 21st in a class of 39, although the statistic's a little deceptive because the West Point class before attrition was as many as 77, but still, you could read Grant's memoirs. He admits vulnerabilities. He talks about an incident soon before the Mexican War where he admits basically his fear of wolves. He vastly overstates the number of wolves that he thinks when there are only 2 of them that are actually growling. He says, well, I think there must be 20 wolves out there, and he thought that was an understatement. He admitted at a time when it was not a vulnerability that men often admitted at that time, but he admits it in his memoirs. When he went out for a turkey hunt, he couldn't even bring himself to aim his gun at the turkeys. He concluded he was a failure as a sportsman. When he went into his first battle in the Mexican War, he admitted to fear. He regretted he had enlisted. That was one of his first reactions. And similarly, when he approached the camp of Colonel Thomas Harris in Florida, Missouri, his first time he's leading troops during the Civil War, he describes how petrified he was. But at the same time, he did have some truly remarkable abilities. He demonstrated from his early age an ability with horses. There were some who thought later he may have been the best horseman in the army. He excelled at math. He was able to skate by academically even when he only read through a lesson once. His mind was able to grasp topography. And while we could never say for sure, it's possible that he had a photographic memory. As president, he reportedly never forgot a face. So the man had no superpowers, but he did have character, and I think that was also essential to his greatness. When we talk about character, we have to acknowledge self-sacrificial courage is a huge part of that. Honesty is a huge part of that. We don't have a concise myth about Grant's honesty to match Parson Weems's George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, but Grant holds his own with any great leader in American history for his honesty. His Secretary of State Hamilton Fish once said Grant could not tell a lie if he had written it down beforehand. Combined with that is compassion, a remarkable lack of prejudice for his time, and tenacity, of course. Now, none of this meant that there were not mistakes along the way. Much of Grant's generalship was about learning from mistakes. His worst military mistake at Cold Harbor was followed by his grand maneuver, his brilliant maneuver across the James River. So if you look at this back from 20,000 feet above the actual events and the actual man, success came, and it came where others had not even been able to come close to that level of success. His leadership really paralleled that of George Washington, which is why some at the time of Grant's death called him the second father of our country. And his legacy endured to a point that all these years later, the U.S. has never again had to fight a civil war. And in response to the long festering criticism of his presidency, I ask, where are the boatloads of presidents who took such decisive action to address the deepest and most seemingly intractable threats to the aspirations of American democracy? To ask that question is to recognize how badly historians misstepped when they denigrated Grant's presidency. In short, Grant was a mere mortal who shows us what talent, drive, and character can achieve despite our frailties. As mere mortals who attain high position go, U.S. Grant was about as good as it gets. Thanks.
So I'm going to begin by admitting that, like all too many Americans, for much of my academic career, I overlooked Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, I remember that in my high school American history class, the teacher had portraits of the presidents, ranked on the wall in order of how scholars had rated their achievement. And I remember that Grant ranked just about dead last. The last category, I still remember, was entitled Presidents Who Disgraced the Office. And I don't know if Grant was there, but he was almost there. It wasn't until I started to study the Civil War in more detail as a graduate student that I came to appreciate Grant more and more. I think the most important moment in that discovery was reading his classic memoirs, which if you haven't done, I suggest you do. It really reveals his humor, his wit, his humanity, his commitment to both the Union, but also his the political convictions that he came to hold. As far as figures in the Civil War era, he was remarkably free of prejudice, and his later political career bore that out, as we've already mentioned, in his achievements in forwarding rights of African Americans, the ex-slaves, in the time after the war. To underscore these points, like Frank, I want to take us to 1877, as Grant is leaving the White House. He joked that the only other place he was more eager to leave was West Point when he graduated. He made no secret that he didn't enjoy his time as a student. But after he leaves the White House, he planned this ambitious trip around the world, and his first destination was the United Kingdom. In his time in the United Kingdom, he traveled to many towns, not just London, but many of the cities and small towns around the country. Without fail, he was greeted there by vast crowds celebrating what they called this hero of freedom, and somebody who connected to the working man and democracy. As I read accounts of his trip, three major themes came out. There are three things that the British people admired Grant for. The first was the successful reunion of the country without vengeance. Secondly, the abolition of slavery. And then thirdly, the peaceful settlement of the Alabama claims. And I'll just say a few words about each of those. First of all, the British people really celebrated Grant for reuniting the United States without vengeful violence, without executing the leaders of the rebellion. And while it is true that Grant didn't shy away from using force during the Reconstruction era, as I'm sure we'll discuss, from the perspective of Europe, this was quite remarkable. They really saw this as democracy in action, that the country could settle its disputes after this incredibly bloody war without further violence and recrimination, and really store democracy. And that's why a lot of the average British people turned out to see Grant, was because they saw both him and the United States as this symbol that democracy was possible. Certainly British reformers at the time really admired that. So that theme came through frequently. Secondly, I was a little surprised about is the abolition of slavery. Right? They credited Grant with the abolition of slavery, and of course they always mentioned that Lincoln initiated, right, abolition with the Emancipation Proclamation, and later his support for the 13th Amendment. But they made the point that it was Grant that activated it. Right? It was Grant that made it possible. It was Grant through his support for Lincoln's emancipation policy and his control of the U.S. armies that emancipation actually happened. I don't think that's wildly off base, right? If you think about generals before Grant, like McClellan, who was opposed to emancipation, was opposed to Lincoln's policies. Grant took the opposite perspective, and while certainly African Americans fleeing plantations had a major role in their own freedom, certainly the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, the biggest engine of emancipation in 1863, 64, and 65 was the U.S. Army. Right? Wherever the U.S. Army went, freedom was possible, and the British public recognized Grant for that. And then thirdly, a episode that we've forgotten today, the peaceful resolution of the Alabama claims. During the Civil War, the Confederacy had built some ships, including the ship, the Alabama, in British ports, and the British authorities had allowed one of those ships to escape, thereby violating Britain's neutrality. And the Alabama went on to raid Union commerce and sink ships around the globe. And so after the war, the American people really blamed Great Britain. And there was this movement to make Great Britain atone, either financially. Some wanted the British to give the United States parts of Canada, perhaps violently. But Grant, the Grant administration put that dispute to international arbitration, and they were able to come to a peaceful settlement with the British. The British did pay the United States an indemnity. But for the British people, this was a man ahead of his time in thinking about how can we settle international disputes peacefully. So those are the three things that the British remembered Grant for, celebrated Grant for. in 1877. I think it underscores how surprised people in both the United States and around the world would have been to know just how far Grant's reputation fell in the 20th century, because as Grant left office, he was one of the most famous of living Americans. He was world famous. His memoirs were one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. So I'm looking forward today to thinking more with you about why that is and how historical memories change and reputations change. Thanks.
Excellent statements. I think it's important to recognize that on this date, 134 years ago, on this very porch, funeral service was held for Ulysses Grant. Some of the major figures of the Civil War were here, and his family, of course, and many veterans of the Civil War were here as well. So today we are gathered to honor his memory by sharing and learning more about his story. Because his story, of course, is intertwined with the American story. Grant is a man whose life is shrouded in myth. The public perception of the man, like many famous figures, is largely shaped by caricatures of his strengths and weaknesses, as well as his successes and failures. His life and character are generalized in an attempt to make them simpler to explain, and this results in misconceptions and mischaracterizations that prove very difficult to dispel. It seems once something gets out there, it's very hard to stop it. For those of us who research Grant more deeply, we realize he is a man with a simple nature, but not without complexity. A man who holds true to his convictions, but is still willing to change. He is shaped by the world he lives in, his experiences, and the opinions of those around him. We try to look objectively beyond the popular generalized conclusions to try to get a better picture of the man. So today's discussion will really be geared toward an honest critical analysis of different aspects of Grant's life and career that highlight both his weaknesses and his strengths. The discussion is really designed to highlight the human side in Grant in contrast to the mythology and hagiography. So we're going to start with moderator questions. I'm going to be asking the panelists some questions here that we've prepared, but we will definitely get to audience questions a little bit later, if you behave. So we'll start with, we're going to go over a couple of subjects, different subjects, not necessarily in chronological order for his life, but the first one has been touched on just slightly, and it's one of those things where a certain part of somebody's life can give you a glimpse into their nature. And so, Grant the horseman. So Grant seemed to be singularly obsessed with horses from a young age. The obsession was matched by a superb ability to train and ride horses. So my question to the panelists, whoever wants to take this one, what can Grant's relationship and ability with horses tell us about his nature? I started with a tough one.
Well, I can make a couple of observations. Grant, of course, as pointed out, was a remarkable horseman, and his ability with horses dated back to a very early age. There were stories of him as a kid being able to tame wild horses, and this goes into his post-West Point graduation. Longstreet has a story about how he tamed this horse that a whole bunch of his comrades were afraid to mount. While he was at West Point, he set a record for the high jump on horseback that lasted a quarter century. I think that goes to a couple of characteristics, by no means limited to two, but one that strikes me is tenacity. When he held on to something, when he held a position, he held it with a bulldog grip, to use the oft-quoted term, the saying from his lifetime. And also, I think it reflected a compassion that he had toward life, toward all of God's creatures. He had a real streak of humanitarianism that flowed through him, and he was something of a zoophile as well. In fact, there were only 2 instances during the Civil War when he is recorded. Of course, there could be others, many that slipped through the cracks of what's not recorded in history books, but only 2 instances when he was seen to have lost his temper. One was when a soldier was assaulting a woman, presumably sexually assaulting a woman around the time of the Iuka campaign, and another was during the Overland campaign in Virginia when he saw a teamster beating a horse. So there are a couple of observations I would make on that.
Al, you have something to add?
Yeah, there's a wonderful American Experience video on Grant, Warrior and President, and historian James McPherson begins talking about Grant's way with horses, and one of the many myths is that he could, at 2 years old, he could hang on a horse's tail, and the horse would put up with it, and he was hauling logs with a team of horses at age 8 and plowing fields at age 11. But McPherson talks about 3 qualities that Grant had: quiet, firm, calm. And those are wonderful qualities in dealing with horses and with human beings. And I think you see those qualities throughout his life. And actually they have something of a downside, which is interesting in terms of Grant's whole reputation. Frank and others have written about this. He doesn't fit the psychological schema or image of the hero, of the big man. He didn't look big, he wasn't big, he didn't sound big, he didn't talk big, and he was quiet and firm and calm, and that produced marvelous results with horses and marvelous results with armies, but it didn't help his reputation.
Very insightful.
Yeah, I would agree with those. I think his love of horses speaks to his empathy. Like any animal lover, he could distinguish, the personalities within horses, the personalities within animals. They were individuals to him, not things. And I think that underscores the degree to which Grant was, this was a sensitive man, Grant. He did not relish violence and war. I think he once wrote, battles are great things to read about for those that lose no friends, right? Accepted war when it was necessary, and as part of his duty, but in his personal life, his relationship with both people and animals, he was very, had this streak of humanism, as I think has been mentioned.
So that was very insightful. Again, it's amazing what you can really glean from someone just from some of their something like the relationship with animals. But I think that was all very very insightful. I'll do a follow-up question since we're we'll stick in his childhood for a moment. Is there anything else about his childhood that shows glimpses of the later man? Any kind of circumstances or events that you see a little flash of the later adult Grant? Al?
Well, I'll just mention one that ties into his business acumen or incompetence.
I know where this is going.
It was a marvelous story. With, he was going to buy a horse from a Mr. Ralston, I think the name was, and he approached Mr. Ralston. And his father had given him careful instructions, and he said to Mr. Ralston, my father told me that I was to offer you $20, but that if you turn that down, I was to offer you $22, and that if you turn that down, I was to offer you $25, and guess how much he paid for the horse. And it's just an anecdote into insight into a sensitive, interesting person who had some strengths and weaknesses, but clearly the business world was not his strength.
I was going to cite, I think that's the first anecdote to cite from his childhood, and it's one that he cited, I was going to say the same thing Al just did.
In his memoirs.
So, the most illustrative, that's one reason I think he actually wrote about this. That's how we know from his memoirs. It's hard to improve on that. As he said when he told this tale, it doesn't take a Connecticut man to figure out the final price agreed upon for the horse.
Yeah, when I think about his childhood, I think we can see his reserved humility. This was a man who didn't like formality. He didn't like calling attention to himself. He might be very embarrassed that we're talking about Grant the hero here today. And you see that in his childhood. When he arrived at West Point, the clerk had made a mistake with his name. They listed him as Ulysses S. Grant. His given name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, and he said nothing. He just accepted it, and his name became...
Bit of a pushover, wasn't it?
Yeah, a little bit. Although some have said that he might have been worried about his initial spelling Hug, and he'd be teased for that, but I don't know if that's true. But he became U.S. Grant. And then, another story, after he graduated from West Point, the only time he, kind of wore his full fancy uniform, he was mocked on the street by a young child. And it's hard for us to understand, but in the mid-19th century, before the Civil War, the military wasn't a universally respected organization. There was this idea that still this citizen soldier, Minuteman idea that you didn't need fancy training, that Americans would pick up their muskets when it was time. So professional soldiers were sometimes looked down on, and this young urchin mocked him for his fancy, expensive uniform, and he said that was the last time he ever wore the uniform with full medals, at least in public. And as many of you as during the war, he preferred an enlisted man's coat with his insignia of rank.
Wonderful. We'll go through a couple of more, but I want to get to audience questions as well, so we're going to skip a few, but for time's sake. But we will. I wanted to touch on one of the biggest, a couple of the biggest discussion points when anybody talks about Grant, whether it be a someone with a casual interest in him, all the way to the most studied scholar on Grant's life. It seems like alcohol, you knew it was coming. Don't act surprised. The alcohol situation seems to take center stage. So if a lot of our visitors, and they're very innocent about it, the first thing they want to know is it true? Was the man an alcoholic? And even scholars do not agree on this. Some of it's what is the perception of an alcoholic, and some of it is, was his behavior the behavior of an alcoholic at all? For instance, author Charles Ellington, in his book, The Trial of Ulysses S. Grant, The Pacific Coast Years, which deals with the 2 years Grant was on the West Coast in the pre-Civil War Army, he concludes that, quote, Grant was not an alcoholic. If he were, he would have a problem in drinking any time, even in a moderate way. Unquote. He goes on to say that after earning a reputation, it was really impossible for him to take a drink without someone noticing due to the scrutiny that he faced after that. Even turning his wine glass over was misconstrued. It really was a no-win situation. So in contrast to this, you have Ron Chernow in his recent biography, Grant, who concludes that, quote, Grant was an alcoholic, with an astonishingly consistent pattern of drinking. Alcohol was not a recreation selfishly indulged, but a forbidden impulse against which he struggled for most of his life. So, two very contrasting opinions. So I will open this up to each panelist to give your thoughts on your impression of Grant's, your honest impression of Grant's relationship with alcohol, how it affected his career and his legacy. Al?
I don't have anything to add to what Chernow said. I mean, I've gone back and forth. Mm-hmm. Every book I read has a somewhat different take on it. It seems to me that Chernow did an extremely thorough job of research, and I think his assessment is very consistent with psychiatric and psychological takes on alcoholism. So I think, yeah, he was an alcoholic. I think he stopped drinking by the time he was president, certainly. I've never heard anything about drinking during his presidency. I don't know whether others have. And I think there's no indication that if he did go on occasional binges during the war, maybe during some slack time during the Vicksburg campaign, that's one that's talked about a great deal. There's absolutely no indication that it hurt his performance. So a functioning alcoholic, I think, is what Chernow would say, and that seems.
That's interesting.
That seems about right.
Well,
to
it's
me.
interesting that you and he didn't slip you a 20. Chernow? No. Okay. So no, but it's interesting that he said functioning alcoholic, because one of the debated subjects on it was whether he was able to be a functioning alcoholic, because there was also the claim that he was had a low tolerance. So obviously those two things are hard to reconcile. So there is that. But that's certainly certainly there's evidence to be pointed to on both of these conclusions. So did you have an opinion on it, Frank? Everybody's got an opinion.
Everyone has an opinion, although I should state, I think, to try to answer with a certain degree of precision, sometimes historians have to say there's a certain zone of uncertainty, and the phrase "I don't know" should be in the historian's lexicon more often than it is. But what I do think, the evidence that we have out there, a lot of it is impressionistic. Virtually all of it came from decades and decades after Grant's public career. In fact, the Hamlin-Garland papers, 1890s, you're talking about interviews with people who had known Grant. And Douglas Southall Freeman, when he was researching his tome, his 4-volume tome on Robert E. Lee, warned about relying too much on the recollections of old soldiers and some other recollections that come from people who tend to sensationalize things. But to the extent we can discern some things about alcohol at the time, first of all, you have to remember the context of the 19th century. Alcohol use was much more common then than it is today. The Army in particular was a hard-drinking outfit, if you were to generalize. The sense is, even though we don't have specific anecdotes, certainly no specific contemporary anecdotes of Grant drinking during his peacetime Army days, but the sense is that there was a period where he drank too much out on the Pacific coast, where he was between 1852 and 54. Now, if you look at those who've taken whatever glimpse they can of Grant and the bottle, some have tried to bring it all the way back to the Mexican War and sometime afterward. And I notice there's some selectivity in recounting some of these sources who, to begin with, as I mentioned before, are talking decades after the fact. And again, I'm not going to, we don't have time here to go through everything, but to give you one example, there's a man, a friend of Grant's in Detroit, who spoke with Hamlin-Garland in the 1890s, who mentioned a discussion that Grant had with his pastor at church. The pastor had talked about how drinking was bad for him, and that excerpt has been often quoted, but then not quoted was part of that same man's account. Pittman was the friend's name, I believe, that Grant did not drink any more than others in the Army. There was nothing distinctive at all about his drinking, either drinking less or drinking more than others. We do have from this vague impressionistic evidence that he, when he did drink alcohol, that it showed on him, that he did not have much of a tolerance for it. That could feed into some of the impressions that people have, but that has nothing to do with whether or not one is an alcoholic. The interesting thing is when you go forward over the years into his public career, you go to Civil War years and then his presidency. Well, during the Civil War, there are a few instances when it was alleged that he drank too much, and there I think there is a zone of uncertainty as to in how many cases he in fact drank too much. One account by Sylvanus Cadwallader during the Vicksburg campaign I think has been thoroughly debunked, but then there are others that could or could not have been, they could or could not have reflected what might at the end of the day be a not very significant truth. Albert Richardson, a correspondent for the New York Tribune who wrote a campaign biography of Grant, or wrote a biography, I should say, it came out in 1868 when Grant was running for president, stated based upon his own observations, actually being in Mississippi following Grant during a significant stretch of the campaign, and in talking to people, that he thought it was very rare. There were rare occasions, but really rare occasions when Grant visibly had too much to drink during the Civil War. And the interesting thing is, by the time he's president, we see that he does, on occasion, have wine with meals or some other drink, and that it doesn't have an effect on him. And this is evidence that specifically belies alcoholism. So I find it interesting that the more Grant, if you look at the impressions about Grant and drinking, the sense is that there was the most drinking going on when he was most invisible, when he was most out of the public eye, and then the more visible he gets, he's more visible as a Civil War general, and there, clearly, whatever drinking there was minuscule compared to whatever was alleged to have been during the Pacific Coast years, even from the most devil's advocates account that you have. And then by his presidency, there's no account of any problem with it at all. And the clinical literature makes it clear how difficult it is to diagnose someone so many years after the fact as an alcoholic when you have the relatively scant evidence that we have in the case of Grant. In fact, the Harvard Journal of Medicine, there's an article not too long ago about the almost alcoholic, referring to someone theoretically who's a college student, drinks too much. Alcohol is a problem for that person, hurts that person's academic performance, but later in life, after that chapter in life, it's not a problem. That person, this one article labeled an almost alcoholic, but didn't fit the clinical definition. It wasn't a lifelong thing. And I don't even know that Grant fit that category, but I think when you look at his Pacific Coast years, it was likely analogous to someone who belonged to a hard-drinking fraternity early in life. And that may have included drinking too much. But I'm more with Charles Ellington on this, who did say he specifically does not think Grant was an alcoholic, and I would recommend to you The Trial of U.S. Grant, Ellington's work on the subject.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that Grant was an alcoholic. I think we could probably all agree that it's clear that he wasn't a daily drinker. There were long stretches, especially when Julia was there, that there's no evidence whatsoever that he drank, and there's certainly no evidence that it affected his performance as a general or as president. So, for a historian, it really does get to those questions of evidence, and the problem is that Grant himself, his wife Julia, the family are silent on this issue. They don't talk about it. So all the evidence we have comes from other people, and I agree that there's pretty solid evidence that when he was stationed in California, he did drink, probably more than he should have. But that issue then dogged him for the rest of his life, in part because he resigned from the Army in California, not because of drinking, but because he missed his family and he was miserable on the West Coast. But that conflation stuck, that in the Army, that Grant drank too much and then resigned and dropped out of the Army in disgrace. And so as his career, first foundered, in peacetime life, and then took off during the Civil War, his enemies, of course, often brought up these charges that Grant was drunk, that Grant had been drinking. To be fair, though, we do have some accounts from his friends, especially John Rawlins, who was on his staff. But Rawlins had a little bit of a self-serving motive in that after the war he depicted himself as the hero that prevented Grant from drinking, and that was Rawlins' contribution to winning the war, that he had kept Grant sober. So he had an interest in maybe making more of it than it was. But I agree, though, there certainly are instances that have good evidence that he did drink, and it seems that I lean more towards the position that he seemed to have a low tolerance for alcohol, that affected him more than other people. And we should also note that he suffered from migraines, which oftentimes would either be self-medicated, in those days with alcohol or some type of concoction, but also could lead people to wrongly think he had a hangover. So it's a difficult question.
So it seems like there's an agreement that no matter how serious his issues with alcohol specifically, he definitely dealt with a reputation problem. That's typically what I tell people as well. I tell them that everything's not known about his alcohol relationship with alcohol, but we do know that the reputation has dogged him to the present day. There's a claim, the claim that Grant was an alcoholic is there was other alcoholics in the military, as we know, in the officer corps. Grant was really just under a lot more scrutiny than some of these men. So I think that the scrutiny is definitely part of it. And again, debating the different technicalities. So we'll move on to something else that I want to throw a curveball here at you guys. There's something that has, if I haven't already, I'm glad we made it through alcohol without a fist fight. This is great. So I wanted to bring up Grant's eccentricities. Okay, this is one that's it's talked about, but it's not really discussed as in a whole sense. So you're not taking his eccentricities, putting them all together and saying, what is this? And this is one thing that I've actually run into just a couple of people that have posed this possibility. Peculiar traits: supreme self-control over emotion, not flinching at bullets or shells, coolness under pressure, distaste for music, shyness with strangers, dislike for crowds and adoration, aptitude for math, obsession with horses, lack of facial expression, uncanny memory for faces and names. Does anybody know where I'm going with this?
Asperger's.
High-functioning autism is what they call it now. So there has been a couple of people that have posed this as a potential possibility that he's on the high end of the autism spectrum, also known as Asperger's. Obviously, back then they had no diagnosis. If he did have it, he had to adjust. He had to make adjustments in coping mechanisms. Do any of you believe that is even a possibility? That it was obviously very hard to diagnose these things long after the fact. But looking at all these eccentricities, do you just see an eccentric character, or do you think there could be more? Oh, I've stumped him.
Wow.
What do you think?
Well, first of all, I can't even begin to diagnose him. But
you're not that kind of a doctor? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not
Okay.
that kind of a doctor. But I think as we talked about before, his reticence, his unwillingness to advocate for himself is certainly peculiar, especially in somebody that achieved what Grant was able to achieve. And there's no doubt that interpersonal politics weren't his great strength. He wasn't someone that was able to cultivate powerful allies. He was someone that tended to, and I admire this, that tended to be rewarded for performance rather than promote himself ahead of time. But as to diagnosing
On this point, well, first I should make a point. We were talking about diagnosing the almost alcoholic clinical designation. I might have miscited the journal. I want to see if I could find, it might have been the New England Journal of Medicine, but there's been a book written about this phenomenon. It's something to explore, I think, and looking more at that question. Certainly, if you're talking about the question of whether one could be diagnosed as being on the spectrum, putting aside my skepticism about diagnosing anyone that way, I think it would be highly unlikely he would be anywhere that we would consider close to Asperger's when you consider something that has been so lost to history, and that is Grant as a conversationalist. And this is something that you hear over and over again. Frederick Douglass, a man of letters who might talk about people who had aptitude with the human language, called Grant one of the greatest conversationalists I have known. And you hear of people who again and again express their surprise at what an animated informative, cheerful, someone who seems to be really comfortable in private settings connecting to people. And it's such a shame that we don't have a hidden camera to have captured that side of Grant, but you hear this about him again and again and again. Not to mention his sensitivity toward people. One element of Asperger's is being
Lack of empathy.
a lack of empathy, which I think he did not have. Even as a commander, he did not bark orders to his men the way many did. He went out of his way to try to consider the feelings of those who are around him. Of course, no one's always successful at those things, but I think those traits would leave me highly skeptical that he was on the spectrum, or if he was anything close to Asperger's. I will say the closest we have to Grant the Conversationalist is John Russell Young's travelogue, 2-volume travelogue from 1879, Around the World with General Grant. And while most of those volumes are Young talking, his observations about the world, included in those volumes are basically transcribed conversations he had with Grant. Grant proofread them afterwards before they were published, so we know that they are reliable. And you get some glimpse there of Grant the Conversationalist.
Did you want to chime in, or?
Yeah, I mean, my first reaction, and it really hasn't gone away, that it doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay.
I mean, I think he's a complicated person. I think all of us are complicated people.
Yeah.
He has a fascinating set of intelligences and abilities and personal qualities that aren't ones you often see together, but it's a level of complexity that seems to me well within the range of human complexity.
Well, there it is. Well, since I would like to actually open up the floor to questions from the audience. You guys have been great and patient. I appreciate that. So we'll start. You had one here in the front? Yeah.
I wondered about Grant's unsuccessful financial investments were usually through an individual that he trusted. If he had been around in Bernie Madow's time, he might have been one of the people who did pretty badly.
Yeah. So I'll just repeat the question.
Repetitiously.
Yeah. So the question is basically was Grant too trusting? His good friend George Childs, who isn't mentioned very much, said that Grant was not only too trusting but also fiercely loyal, even beyond the point of reason. So a couple of traits. Would any of you like to comment on Grant's overly trusting nature, as it's called?
Yeah, I think he could be. I think he was overly trusting with some people. On the other hand, he did smell out some rats occasionally.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing with Gould and Fisk, where we stopped the whole gold market manipulation was pretty savvy. Josiah Bunting's biography talks about Grant when he was engaged to be extremely effective and extremely smart in all kinds of ways, but those times were alternated with strange periods of torpor, I think is the word that he uses. So that there's sometimes you get a sense of Grant being unplugged throughout his life, and I think that's a reasonable characterization. Although I'm struck by Frank saying historians ought to say, I don't know more often than we do. But there are instances where he overly trusted people, but I'm not sure it was a characterological thing that was always the case. I think he's pretty savvy about his military lieutenants. So it's a mixed bag.
Everybody's on Google right now looking up torpor. That's why. You had to.
Yeah, I would second what Al had said. I think you do see, especially during the Civil War years and even during his presidency, the Gold Corner scheme is one example, but there are others where he's more shrewd, more keen to more wise to the ways of the world than a lot of biographers have depicted him. But when you talk about his business sense, both before the war and after his presidency and tour around the world, you definitely see the naivete, the lack of business acumen. There was a certain guilelessness to him. Now, there's a saying, it takes one to know one, and those who are chronically dishonest may be more likely to see dishonesty in other people. Maybe on the other end of the spectrum, those who tend to be exceedingly honest are less able to see the opposite trait in others, which is not to say that they can't see it. But you do see before the Civil War, there are several attempts being made to make money. None of them quite work out. After the war, you mentioned Madoff. Well, Grant was taken in by someone who was the Madoff of his day. Ferdinand Ward this was at the point when Mr. Ponzi was still a toddler in Italy, but they didn't coin the term Ponzi scheme yet. But what Ward did was he basically ran a pyramid scheme. He backed up multiple loans with the same collateral. They were fraudulent transactions, but the Grant and Ward, the principal was really Ulysses S. Grant Jr., who was just as much taken in as his father, but Grant really delegated it to his son, who was, by the way, a Columbia law graduate. He was not a nobody. He was a man of great intelligence and skill. The entire family was taken in, and of course,
And
Buck,
other investors.
and many other investors
too.
So Buck, Ulysses Jr., becomes a successful businessman later in life, San Diego. But you do see these poignant bookends to Grant's public career, where he never quite has that business sense, and he is either unsuccessful and later on, of course, taken in, and to his very last days is finding a way to make money to fill that hole that was created by the collapse of Grant and Ward.
It seems as though, an analysis was done by Brooks Simpson in Triumph Over Adversity, where he does try to balance it a bit with the circumstances that Grant was under, and the nation was under during some of these failures and business failures. Certainly, he didn't have the heart to collect rent, but that there was other forces as well. So just to balance it a little bit with his naivety versus circumstances beyond his control.
Yeah. What I would say is, I think everything that's been said is absolutely correct. But Grant is certainly not the only 19th century figure to go under in economic. And the reason is because the economic system then was bewildered. It was easy to get into a really bad deal. Banks were unregulated. We're still on the gold standard. The greenback was new. There were all kinds of schemes for investing in railroads, for investing in new businesses, you had, the savvy businessmen had to be careful about where their money was. What paper was it in? What is it in greenbacks? Is it in stocks? Before the Civil War, is it in bank notes? The banks were completely unregulated. If you had your money with a bank that went under, you lost it. So, we're dealing with an era, before the FDIC, before the Federal Reserve. But I don't know that completely excuses Grant's bad luck. But it
so it seems like it's a mixture, really. But certainly not necessarily a strength of Grant's, for sure. His business acumen, not necessarily a strength. I think, it's one of those things like I was mentioning earlier, though, that I see a caricature. I see some, where you take something and it becomes its own caricature. Grant the business failure. Grant the alcoholic. Grant the... So even if it's based on a somewhat of a premise, there is this kind of mythology that grows out of it. So we'll go on to the next question here in the front.
Yeah, I think also one thing that's suffered is that's always been underplayed is this role that Grant has played in bringing the United States into the world stage. With the centennial, the 1876 centennial, the whole nature of that. And then secondly, almost immediately following that, once he left the presidency with this world tour. And I wonder if you could comment on what, he obviously must have had some idea of this, because this is extraordinary. He could have just left the White House and gone to retire or something, but he must have some idea, hey, I'm going to take the United States to the world. So I wonder if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think we have to start with the realization that, certainly part of Grant's unionism, his devotion to the Union, was the idea that a united country, a united United States was going to be a major player on the world stage in the late 19th century and looking forward into the 20th century. And Grant certainly was aware of that. If the United States had split into two, who knows what would have happened. But certainly as president, he was not the first, but one of the first presidents to be very supportive of a canal in Central America to link the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans that would increase American commerce and make the U.S. A global power. He was interested in acquisitions in the Caribbean, in part, and I think that this has been overlooked in part because of his anti-slavery politics. He believed, that acquiring San Domingo, for example, would promote free labor in the hemisphere and put pressure on the remaining slaveholding regimes in Cuba and Brazil, and serve as this model community of wage labor, and also perhaps a place where African American businessmen could prosper. Important to note that Grant always believed that should be voluntary. He was not, in favor of involuntary colonization. So he very much believed that the legacy of the Civil War was a U.S. that was going to be a world power in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century.
It seems
Right
like
about that,
it seems like he also had some vision for something like the United Nations. It seems like what he was saying, at times, maybe Frank knows the specific circumstances when he said it. I don't remember the quote, the reference, but I do remember reading that he made comments as to international tribunal.
Yes, during his presidency, we mentioned the Alabama claims before. This was the dispute with Great Britain that arose from the construction of Confederate raiders, commerce raiders, that were built in British shipyards. Now, they were not built by the British government. The British government was officially neutral, but private shipbuilders were constructing essentially the Confederate Navy. They were not quite fitted with guns, but they did a lot of this in plain sight, especially in Liverpool. And this was a site of the source of great soreness between the countries afterwards, because so much damage was done by these Confederate commerce raiders that were built in Britain. Andrew Johnson's administration bungled this to a point that you had Charles Sumner as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, who seemed to be building a premise for war, suggesting a little far-fetched theory that these commerce raiders did so much damage that had it not been for these raiders, the Civil War would have ended at Gettysburg, and the last 2 years of the war, consider how much that cost, it was about $2 billion or however much the amount was. This is what Britain owes us, and he threw out this astronomical sum that people thought, well, maybe that's about the value of the landmass of Canada. You can see where this thing is going. Well, Grant's resolution of the Alabama claims was remarkable not only because it was resolved in favor of the United States, but also in how it was done. The Treaty of Washington of 1871 established that there would be a tribunal of neutral arbitrators that would meet in Geneva the following year, that they would take this matter and decide what would happen. Now, there's a long history to international arbitration going back to ancient Greece and in U.S. history even with the Jay Treaty, but you never had in memory a matter of such gravity that typically nations go to war over it that was resolved peacefully by arbitration. And you had among the five countries that submitted arbitrators, you had 3 from neutral countries, then 1 appointed by President Grant and 1 by Queen Victoria. If you go to Geneva today, by the way, you can still see the Alabama room where the tribunal met. And the success of this arbitration helped fuel a peace movement in the West, and especially pronounced in the United States and Britain, that there be some international body that could help find alternatives to war. If you want peace, don't do too badly having a professional soldier in the White House. Either they call it the executive mansion at the time, or they call it the president's house back in George Washington's day. They know what war is. And it is remarkable, you do see Grant, during his trip around the world, when he's in England, he actually says, it's a dream of mine that there may be some such tribunal that would take cognizance of questions of international difficulty and resolve them the way our Supreme Court does. And that precedent that was set with the Geneva Tribunal was seen as something that inspired later efforts like the Hague Tribunal, the World Court, the League of Nations. So that, I think, is one of the most remarkable aspects of Grant's career people don't know. And to be sure, his trip around the world, he was essentially a diplomat for the United States. And what
There is
started,
a book on that.
There is Edwina Campbell.
Yeah, it's the post-presidential diplomacy of Ulysses S. Grant. I believe that's it. We have it for sale in the gift shop.
Great.
And did you want to chime in? Okay. So we're going to take the next question. I think somebody, Rich, all the way in the back.
I would like the panel to comment on Grant's Indian policy. It seems to me, in some of my readings, that he backed off of aggressive Indian policy after the Battle of Custer and the Little Bighorn.
Okay, so the question is, did Grant's Indian policy start to essentially fall apart, or did he intentionally, pull it back after Custer's last stand, 1876? Does anybody want to chime in on that? On the forces that? And there is a book on this too. There's a new book on this as well.
There is a new book.
The Interrupted Odyssey
Okay.
is what the name of the book is.
Grant's Indian policy it was a remarkable, just for some background, Grant made several statements really outspoken on the plight of what he called the original inhabitants of this land, and talked about the wickedness of what he described as wars of extermination. And although the country had a nominal reservation policy at that point, the reality was the government was on a trajectory of precisely that kind of war. Indian tribes were seen as foreign countries. They were dealt with by the government through treaties, which of course were routinely broken. There was not enough presence of federal troops to stop some of the expansion that was occurring westward and some of the fighting that was taking place. But the interesting thing about Grant's Indian peace policy is it created a new paradigm to deal with these tribes. Instead of dealing with them the way you would foreign countries, even though they're within the borders, the federal government would be responsible for the first time for the welfare of Indians as individuals. And this envisioned the sending out of emissaries, largely clergy from various religious denominations, to go out and do the work of helping to assimilate Indians. Now, this is, of course, really controversial, and if you look, a lot of the work, a lot of the writing on this is pretty condemnatory of just about everything the federal government did toward the Native Americans during this period. But I think if you look at it in the context of the day, manifest destiny has already been established. You had this country that went from coast to coast. This was the alternative that was seen. I think it was the only politically viable alternative that was seen to extermination. And by the metric, even though it's an imperfect one, because you're dealing with real differences in culture between the sort of the Western European culture that was imported here, of land ownership, and so forth, that a lot of some Indian tribes did have something close that some didn't. That's another mistake people shouldn't make, is assume that all Indian tribes looked at these things the same way, because there's wide variations among the tribes. But if you look at statistics like the presence of the amount of cultivated land, schools, cattle, things like that, the metrics that most American citizens enjoyed, all of those statistics multiplied as a result of Grant's Indian policy. But it was limited ultimately by the Indian Wars, and the Black Hills, once they were invested by people who were rushing for gold, and Grant did not have a high regard for Custer after the Civil War on a number of fronts, but his troops and his Interior Department found that they were really overrun, and you do have a limitation. Some call it the unraveling of his policy. I think that goes a little too far. What he did actually did help set the stage for the ultimate citizenship, the ultimate opportunities for citizenship that Native Americans had. But to be sure, the Indian Wars did compromise that. But to go back to an earlier observation I made, not exactly looking at boatloads of American presidents who try to tackle such difficult issues with the level of decisiveness that Grant did.
And I think it's the one thing that stuck out with me is you said politically viable. You know, I think that has to do with, you know, Grant obviously assumes blame as president for a lot of things that may have not been achieved during his term or things that occurred during his term. But you're obviously, all presidents are limited to some extent. And I know that the new book explains how he set up a council or a committee. I can't remember, the Indian Committee, Indian Council, and that they ran away with the control. They wrested control from him. So there was some control loss that was, you know, something he created that just, you know, got out of control, and the power shifted from him to them. So I think those, you know, things, you know, play into it as well with pretty much everything, you know, he did or didn't accomplish. Did anybody else want to chime in on that?
I just want to chime in on that. I think it's impressive how consistent Grant's rhetoric is about protecting the original inhabitants of the land, the Aborigines. I think he used that term. He was close to L.E. Parker, was the Seneca chief, and I think appointed him as the first administrator for Indian affairs. It seems to me that his heart was really in the right place, way ahead of his time, as Frank was saying. But you look at the political situation of 1876. You know, the Republicans have lost the House of Representatives. You know, Grant is standing alone on racial issues, it seems to me, both for African Americans and for Native Americans. But I think, try to hold back the slaughter of Native Americans after Custer was just too difficult. It's interesting, again, the historical reputation of Grant. Richard White has a relatively new book, I think 2 years old, in the very prestigious Oxford history of the Oxford American history. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but he's very, very hard on Grant's Indian policy from A to Z. Now it's interesting that a review of that book in the Times said it's a great book, except he really misses Grant and is not up with recent Grant scholarship.
Alrighty, well, let's take the next question.
Somewhat similar question. Would the panel comment on allegations of anti-Semitism on Grant's part during the war and then in his administration?
We're getting into all the nitty-gritty here. Yeah. So the question was, you know, well, I guess, you know, Grant's relationship with the Jewish people and how that changed throughout his career.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because I think it's a fascinating area. And Jonathan Sarna wrote this wonderful book called When Grant Expelled the Jews. General Orders Number 11, I think it was, where he expelled all Jewish traitors from the whole War Department of whatever it was that it comprised a huge area. And Lincoln very, very quickly pulled back on that policy and rescinded it. But then Grant's treatment of Jews and why he did that gets into all kinds of ethical issues with his father and so forth, which would be fun to get into, but it'll take us a bit. It became an issue when he ran for president in 1868 against Horatio Seymour. I mean, some of the Democrats tried to make hay on Grant's alleged anti-Semitism. Once he became president, according to Sarna, it was a golden age for Jewish Americans. And this touches basically one of the other topics, which is his involvement in international affairs, condemning pogroms in Russia and Romania, I believe, and really talking about human rights in a way that hadn't been talked about until Eleanor Roosevelt and Jimmy Carter. It seems to me. So things he did for Jews during his presidency as a way of, I think, making up for what he knew, and Julia told him was a terrible, terrible mistake, is quite impressive. So I don't think he was anti-Semitic in any meaningful way.
Like, it's interesting that Julia in her memoirs refers to General Orders Number 11 as that obnoxious order.
Yeah.
And Ulysses does not mention this in his memoirs, but Julia had her memoirs published in 1975. And the interesting thing, I think that is the only public act of her husband's that she has any negative attitude or any criticism of, and when she talks about that, she refers to how he was rebuked at the time by congressmen, he said, deservedly so. It was something that he really regretted. Now, the backdrop of it was the regulations that were operative at that time said you cannot trade cotton with Confederates except in certain very tightly regulated circumstances. And at a time when anti-Semitism was ingrained in culture, and certainly in the Army, reports came to Grant that the violators, they were referred to as Jews or Israelites in various pieces of correspondence, and Grant has this order issued that addresses them as a class for violating these orders, that they're expelled from his military department. Well, Grant does, as Al had mentioned, he does specifically disavow this when he's running for president. It's clear he felt badly about it at the time, and that golden age for American Jewry wound up including not only an unprecedented number of appointments to public office of American Jews, but maybe most significant was Benjamin Pesado, who was appointed consul to Romania, who came with a handwritten letter from President Grant in his hand. He brought to Romania at a time when pogroms were running rampant. There was a very anti-Semitic government there and a lot of violence that accompanied him, and said, oh, you know, our country recognizes no distinction based on religion, and I trust that you will receive Mr. Pesado and accord him all due respect, whatever the language was that he used. And so you see several of these instances of Grant showing what I think really was a truly humanitarian and remarkably unprejudiced nature, which is why, interestingly enough, historians have not affixed to him the label of anti-Semite. And Jonathan Sarna, again, I would recommend that you read his book. He did a masterful job at this.
So I'm going to break for just a moment, and it's 3:30 now. I don't know if anybody was putting off their tour till 3:30. If they want to go on at 3:30, we got one starting just now. We're just going to take one or two more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. But we'll first I'll let Andre comment on the American Ulysses and.
Sure. Yeah. Just briefly. Briefly. I mean, I think that this episode is an example of Grant acting upon stereotypes without reflection, which is very uncharacteristic of Grant. But as has been explained in his, when he entered the presidency, he did take steps to atone for that. And whether you see that as a political act or sincere, I'll leave that up to you. But it certainly went beyond tokenism.
Excellent.
We often hear about Grant as the president and Grant as the general. Could we hear your insight on Grant as the husband, the father, and the grandfather?
Whoever wants to take off first.
Sure. I mean, Grant was very much a family man. He and Julia had a very close relationship. He many times put it in terms of a need for her, a need for her stability, for his emotional well-being. He was, as a father, he was not particularly strict. He encouraged his children to play games, participate in hobbies, play sports. When they were in the White House, one of his sons, they had a baseball league, I guess, that they played on the White House lawn. So family, was certainly very important to Grant.
The Grant's marriage is seen as perhaps the happiest that a president has ever enjoyed. It was a warm, rich marriage, and one that started from when both were young, with a certain innocence that I think the two of them shared, a great affection that the two had for each other, a dry sense of humor that I think also animated their marriage. But it is interesting to see how, even into middle age, Ulysses and Julia are seen holding hands, carrying on really like teenagers, and him being naturally, I think, embarrassed when he was, caught like that. But the two they always seem to have open channels of communication and affection that never quite faded. And one of the telling anecdotes that sort of illustrates how unconditional their love was, when they were in the White House, Julia had a strabismus. One eye was slightly crossed. And even then, during the 1870s, there was a medical procedure to fix this. So she arranged to have this procedure done without telling her husband until he saw her when she was basically, soon before she was on her way to getting this procedure done. And when she explained what was going to happen, her husband told her, well, those are the eyes I fell in love with. I might not like you so much with any other eyes. And she said, well, I was only going to do this for you. And then, of course, she did not go to have the procedure done. But that gives you a sense of just how warm the marriage was. Even Grant's worst enemies could never allege that he ever strayed in his marriage. And then as a father, he was a very doting and affectionate father. You see so many instances of him wrestling with his kids, play wrestling, of course. And one of the perks of being a commanding general is you're able to call for your wife and children to be with you. And when he was able to do that, he took advantage of it and spent a bit of his time during his campaigns with his wife and some combination of his children at his side.
And I'll mention real quickly, there is also books on that we have in the gift shop. There's a book of Grant and Julia's letters. There's two books now. Another one came out, compiled by Chernow, I think, of Grant and Julia's love letters. Their relationship survived a nearly 4-year separation during the Mexican War. I'd imagine any relationship that can last like that in the beginning is one that's going to last for many years. So there are some books that do highlight that. Their relationship as well. Did you want to comment as well?
I just want to say, I think he was a marvelous family man with his wife and children. And if you compared him with either President Roosevelt or even Abraham Lincoln's very tortured relationship with his eldest son, it is really remarkable. And I got a sense of Grant between 1859 and 1861, living above the store in Galena, being as much in the background as he possibly could. But he was with his wife and family, and I think was quite happy actually with
it does seem like that's where his happiness was centered, with his family. Yeah. When they came back from their world tour, they chose to live in New York City because that's where the sons were living, in that area. So it seems like family was the center of his existence. And of course, here at Grant Cottage, that was the reason he willed himself to live here at this cottage for the last 6 weeks as well. We'll take at least one more question here, and then maybe the panelists would be nice enough to stick around for a little bit if anybody has private questions. Sure.
I had basically the same question as she did. However, I do want you all to know that Julie also wrote a memoir, and it's only 99 cents on Kindle.
We do have it available in the gift shop as well. I'm not just here to sell books, but there are some good books that aren't as well known. Some of them are even out of print. The General's Wife, I think they just started printing again. That's from the 1950s. That's an excellent book about Julia's life and her relationship with Ulysses S. Grant in a more personal way. So that's got a lot of good information in it. I don't know if you guys have any other books about their family life. I mean, Jesse, his youngest son, wrote a book. It was only published 1 year, I think 1921, something like that.
You mean in the days of my father, General Grant?
Yes, in the days of my father, General Grant. So, and Fred Grant never wrote a book, but he wrote remembrances. And the one thing that comes through, you see in Grant, is that he's always sending these amazingly touching letters to his, and encouraging letters to his children in the midst of the worst of the Civil War. You know, right after Cold Harbor, of course, he writes this letter to his young daughter, and it's just so touching, and it seems like the war's not even going on. So certainly his sphere with his family was definitely a whole different sphere. Any more questions before we wrap up? All right. Oh, one more.
I'm just curious, was Grant able to include in his administration or in his White House staff any former slaves?
That's, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it'd be easier to probably say African American.
Grant appointed Frederick Douglass to be secretary of a commission that was exploring the Santo Domingo annexation. Now, President's staff at the time was nothing like the White House staff or executive office that you have today. You had a hand, you could count on one hand the number of private secretaries that the president had. That was the staff. But it would be another 90 years before you'd have an African-American cabinet member.
There was a first in his, was it a diplomat?
Ambassador to Haiti. Yeah.
Ambassador to Haiti. Okay, that's why it's great to have these guys here. You know somewhere there's a reference, and these guys are the reference. This is great. Well, this has been wonderful, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I thank you so much I thank the panelists so much.